Hi, good evening. My name is Josiah G. Stone. What a great day today, huh? Sunny, warm, cool nights. It's good for putting a nice red blush on my apples. And my story is a story about apples and farming here in Shrewsbury. To start with, I'm a fourth descendant of Stones that came here to Shrewsbury. My great-grandfather, Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Stone, married in Framingham in 1722 to Liz Brown from Sudbury. They moved to Shrewsbury in 1727, same year that the town was incorporated, and they started a farm on the post road right past the center. My grandfather, Jasper Stone, he moved to closer to the center of town, and he married Bridget Cushing. That was Bridget Cushing was the daughter of Colonel Cushing. He was the leader of the Minutemen who went to the Battle of Lexington and conquered, brought the Minutemen to both towns. And finally, Josiah, my father, had me in 1808, and he had my brother Job Cushing Stone in 1815. He married his longtime sweetheart, who lived right in the White House. You can see the little red shed, the White House right over there. She was Hannah Harrington Slocum. Her father was kind of a big shot in town, assessor, selectman. He also ran a sawmill, which was very handy. I have a picture of the house my father built. This is down on Main Street, 647 Main Street. If you'd like to pass it around, you can see the house and the barn in the back. I was both a farmer and also a nurseryman. In 1840, I took a wagon to Boston, and with funds from my father and my brother, I came back with 2,000 fruit trees. We set all the fruit trees out in the pastures out behind my house, all the way going over from Main Street almost to Spring Street. Nothing but fruit trees. Besides the orchard, I also raised some farm animals, but it's fruit trees where I made my money. Apples in New England, one of the best crops. You table apples, cider apples. Take an apple like this when you're not, even the drops, peeled, cored, sliced, you dry them over the fireplace, that last all winter. You could take them also, crush them, get the cider. Sweet cider was a very big product in New England. After a few months, sweet cider became hard cider. You became even more popular with the guys in town selling hard cider. Finally, the hard cider's no good. It's turned to cider vinegar. You sell it to the tannery. Here's a big keg like this. We would fill this up with cider. Like I said before, once it turned hard, you drink it. It's because of the fermentation and the sugar that's eaten by the yeast. It would become hard cider. But later on, my apples would also be sold around to other markets, into Boston, Worcester, and also some of Shrewsbury apples also went to Europe. Let me show you another picture. I have another picture of my home. I have two sons. I have Emery and I have Henry. And when I pass away in 1891 at 83, Henry does some remodeling and takes my nice colonial and makes it a little bit different. But that's the house there, same house. And I have a nice little map they made up. This is a map, 1898. It's got a little star. You can see where my property is. It says Henry Stone. Well, anyways, 1835, I married my longtime sweetheart, Hannah Harrington Slocum, and we live in my dad's house. I'm doing quite well now. I'm not wealthy, but I'm pretty prosperous. This stone has both my dad, there's my dad Josiah, and my grandfather Jasper. Over on this side, my son Emery. Henry's not here. Henry's at a different cemetery. Emery here, born in 1844, he's right by our side. You can kind of see the large stone plot here. The last thing that most people in the town know me for is I started a journal. 1838, I was about 28 years old. I started writing down every day. Nice weather, 40 degrees, sunny. Did some work on the farm. I kept the journal for 50 years. Everything that went on. Doc Fay came over, pulled my tooth, and won for Emery, gave him $1. Everything. Talking about also the Worcester Universalist Church, 1848. 4 teams, 6 horses of sleighs going on a sleighing party to Northborough, passed by my house. I also, very ingenious man, I also made a little area out back and I took in travelers. I did lodgers overnight. And in one time in my journal, I had some drovers come, I put them up for the night. I had 93 steers in my back pasture. I charged them 6 cents a piece to keep their steers. I've got a picture of me a little bit before my death. Kind of looks like that. I shaved the beard off. Looks a little bit like me. Many years following my passing, the Worcester Telegram did a nice article on me being a nurseryman growing apples in my journal, and they printed it in the paper. And that's about all.
Hello everybody. My name is Leander Fay. I was born on September the 19th, 1844 in Southborough. Pretty far away, but we made our way up here to Shrewsbury. What I want to tell you about was on the 4th of July in 1861, the war between the states had begun. And on the common over here, oh, it was beautiful. The bands were there. They were playing marching music, and the preachers were talking about how we need to protect this country from those people that want to destroy it and keeping people in slavery. And the girls had pretty dresses on, and they looked at, anyway, I said, I'm going to join as soon as I can. So on my 17th birthday, on September the 19th, I joined the Army, the 25th Regiment that was right here in Shrewsbury, signed up. They marched us down to Camp Lincoln in Worcester, where we got uniforms and did some drilling, learned how to hold our guns without shooting ourselves and that sort of thing. And then finally, they put us on the cars. Does that mean anything? The ones that go down the tracks, you know? They took us down to Baltimore, and then down to Washington, D.C., and then we marched down to Virginia. And for 3 years, it wasn't too exciting. I did a lot of digging, a lot of chopping wood, a lot of putting tents up and taking tents down. Once in a while, we'd hear fire of cannons and rifles, and one time I saw a shell explode in the air. And then, in the June of 1861, General Ulysses S. Grant led us up to a place where we were going to have a battle against Robert E. Lee, who had his rebels entrenched down in these pits with logs and boards 7 miles long. And we were to keep them from coming forward. They weren't trying to come forward, but we were to keep them from moving. We're going up against them, and they were shooting at us, and they were jumping over. And the word among the troops was, don't fall down, because they'll jump out and they'll stab you with their bayonets. And men were falling on the ground all over the place. 3,000 of us were wounded or killed in that one day, that one time. And I was one of them. I was shot in the side. My arm was badly shattered. And I had to go to a hospital, which was really guys lying underneath a tree, away from all the action there, and my arm had to be cut off. And I think I must have bled a lot. I was probably what they would call today shock, and I died. So that was the end of my story. I think I was brought back here and buried right here, but I'm not sure about that, because I have a feeling that probably my body was put in a mass grave with all the other fellows who died that same day. There's another name on this tombstone of somebody I didn't even know. Had the same name, but I think it might have been a sister who was born later. And I think that my name was just put in there. And that was the end of Leander Fay. So I come back here and I look around and I think to myself, if I had lived, I could be the great-great-grandfather of that little girl right there. Yeah, I could be your great-great-great-grandfather, maybe, who knows? She looks scared about that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Welcome. We're so pleased for you folks to join us here tonight at our final resting place, the resting place of my parents, Henry and Cynthia, and one of my children who were buried here. Just to introduce myself, my name is Romeo Allen, and I was born and raised my entire life until my death here in the good town of Shrewsbury. I was born in Shrewsbury on October 17th, 1852. And I was born at the old family homestead, the 8th generation of Allens when I was born, to be born at 385, what you folks now call South Street. The property is still there. The building is there. Changed just a bit since the time that I was born, and my brother was born up there. I was educated in the Shrewsbury public school system, and after I finished high school, I apprenticed and continued my education in the family engineering, civil engineering business in Worcester. The business was called Charles Allen and A.W. Wood Engineering, and I studied there and apprenticed there and became a surveyor. I stayed in Shrewsbury after my apprenticeship there, and indeed my business was I was a surveyor. We were farmers and we were lumberers during that period of time. In 1877, having met the beautiful Abby Green, we were married. I always had problems remembering the date, and that always got me in trouble.
May the 24th.
They have a wonderful way of remembering those dates, don't they? Okay. In addition to my business interests here in Shrewsbury, I became very, very involved in town business, municipal business here in Shrewsbury. I served as a selectman. I served as the auditor. You folks call that, I think, treasurer now. And then I was elected as the town moderator here in the community of Shrewsbury, where I served for 40 years. I served until the end of 1927, in which I said 40 years is enough of that, and I moved on to other activities. Now, some of the new residents up here have told me that there was a newcomer after I was here who also served as moderator in this community and tried to outdo me in terms of service, but he didn't do it. He only served for 35 years, some guy named Byrne, okay? In addition to that, I served as the state representative for the community of Shrewsbury in Boston in 1895 and again in 1898. And my church was the Congregational Church, and for 49 years I served as the clerk for the Congregational Church Association. And I gave that up in 1938 when I wasn't feeling particularly well, and I died. Now, the little plaque there says I died in 1940, and that's not accurate. I died on February 29th, 1939, leap year day on that year. My lovely wife, Abby, has some things she'd love to share with you.
Abby G. Green, also of Shrewsbury, all my life, until I married the handsome Romeo Allen and became Abby Allen. However, though named Romeo, doesn't always necessarily live up to that heritage of the name, albeit a good man. He served the town, he served the church, I served Romeo. Gave him two fine sons. Charles was the 9th generation of Allens to live in the Allen, what you call the Allen homestead, and Lee, who lived on Main Street, 635 Main Street. I think now too, by the way, of all these interlopers that came in from Worcester to build their summer mansions in our town of Shrewsbury, I've noted lately, as I have passed through the town upon occasion, those mansions are gone. Our homestead is still on South Street. Though you cut down a lot of the apple trees, and that disturbs me just a little bit. I passed away in 1936 at the ripe old age of 80. In those days, you died in childbirth or you lived to your 80s. one or the other. I fortunately made it to 80. And I left behind, I loved those 4 grandchildren. Charles and Stuart and Howard. But the best of all, and the one I just did not want to leave behind, little Caroline, named after her father, Charles. Caroline was my joy. And I hope that those 4 have left in this town many Allens, who, if you check whatever that book is and whatever a telephone is, I think you'll see that there are a lot of our descendants still here in the town of Shrewsbury, which we both love so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much. Whatever that Red Sox is.
Well, they were around when you were a middle-aged man, don't you remember? They
Well,
were
he
around.
might have when he went to Boston, but I never got to Boston.
He's just not living up to it.
I know.
Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Let me introduce myself. I'm Calvin Reed Stone, and I was born here in Shrewsbury in 1793. I was one of 17 children. We had a big family, and you might wonder, how did we manage that? The answer is Dad married twice. First, he married Lydia Rice, and they had 7 children together. and unfortunately, she passed away, and they remarried. He remarried to a widow. Her name is Mary Field, and she had already had 6 children by her first husband, Mr. Ebenezer Field. He was a veteran of the War of Independence, and then the 2 of them, my dad and Mary, they had some more children, and the result was we had 17 kids in the family. Dear old Dad was no slouch, though. He was a veteran of the War of Independence. He was in Job Cushing's company of Minutemen. In 1775, he went down to Cambridge, and in 1777, he was at Saratoga and received General Burgoyne's surrender. After that, he settled down here in Shrewsbury. He became a thrifty and prosperous farmer. And I will tell you, with 17 children, you have to be thrifty. He became the first postmaster in town, and he became a selectman. I decided to follow in dear old Dad's footsteps. I became a merchant here in town. I don't know if you know where Willie's Steakhouse is. That was my store. And the house where dear Dad and our family lived, I don't know if you know that over there, Maple Avenue and Main Street branch off from each other. And the first street on the, I think it's nowadays, it's on the right, is Westwood Road. And there's a big white house at the end of that street. And that was our family's house. That's where I grew up. But when I married to Susan Fitch from Salem in 1822, I decided to build a house of my own, and I built it right next door to Dad's house. So we were living side by side. I'm there in the store all day selling nickel cigars and whatever, and meanwhile the newspapers come in day after day, and I'm looking through the newspapers when it's slow, and as I look, I see that, by jingo, there are fellas going out west where there's loads of land. You remember 1803, they purchased, the Louisiana Purchase, millions of acres. And the federal government set the price of 1 acre of land at $1.25. It was as cheap as the dirt. So lots of fellas, they realized this is an opportunity to make big bucks. And so they headed out west and they bought land cheap and sold it dear to the torrent of new settlers that were coming in. They were coming in from the Erie Canal. They'd go down the lakes and land in Chicago and then spread out from there. Well, I'm no fool. I decided that I'm going to play the game too and make my money. So I contacted my nephew. He lives in Warren, Massachusetts. His name is Joseph Field, and the 2 of us, we went out to St. Louis, Missouri. We started our own land real estate speculation business. We teamed up there with a local miller. His name was Dennis Marks, and we established a firm of Stone, Field, and Marks. And while we're out there, we went up the Mississippi River, and we laid out a little town. It was called Worcester, Illinois. And it's still there. Unfortunately, they made a very, in my opinion, a foolish decision. They changed the name to Berry, but it's still there. And while we were there, we built a little grist mill for the farmers so that when their crops finally came in, they'd be all set to grind up their wheat into flour and sell it along the Mississippi. Everything is going fine. There's only one problem, and that is that everybody else had the same idea. This may sound familiar to you folks, because all of a sudden there were all these real estate speculators buying up land, and land in Pensacola, Florida, which was just about a swamp back then, was selling. 1 acre land there was selling for more than 1 acre land in downtown New York. Well, unfortunately, this state of affairs can't last very long, and it didn't. In 1837, the whole house of cards came tumbling down. The banks went bust. The real estate speculators went bust. Unemployment went through. Does this sound familiar to you folks? Does this? And anyway, we fortunately managed our affairs very well, and we managed to survive the bust. So in 1838, I decided that I'm going to go up to Cincinnati, talk with some of the money men, and keep on making good business. So in April 25th of 1838, I've accomplished my business. It's time to go back home to St. Louis. Time is money. And so I decided that I'm going to take the fastest steamboat on the Mississippi. And that steamboat was sitting right down at the wharf. It was called a Moselle, and the captain was Mr. Isaac Perrin. And so I bought a ticket, and along with 280 to 300 other folks, I got on board. And the captain said, we're just going to go about a mile or two upriver to a little suburb. It was called Fulton, still there. And we're going to pick up a few extra people, a little more freight, and only be a few minutes, be patient, and then we'll head back down to St. Louis. And he promised us that since he had made a record run from St. Louis to Cincinnati on the way up, he was going to beat it on the way back. Don't worry, folks. So we load up, and just as we're pulling away from the docks, there was the biggest explosion that you ever heard. And the forward part of the ship, it was a side wheel paddler. Everything from the side wheels forward blew up into splinters. People were thrown into the water. One fellow, his name is Mr. Watts, he's a merchant from Springfield, Massachusetts. He was thrown so far and so high that he ended up punching through the roof of a house nearby. They had to cut through the roof to get him out. The captain, he ended up in front of what was left of him, ended up in front of a sawmill nearby. And so it was a pretty grim scene, and unfortunately, yours truly was one of the victims. But I am here tonight by special request, and so I'm here to indulge the Shrewsbury Historical Society. And anyway, the folks of Cincinnati, they decided that they were going to organize immediately an investigation into what happened. Fortunately, however, there wasn't much to investigate because the second engineer, the man who was in charge of the steam engine on board the steamboat, he had managed to survive, and he told the story of what happened. His boss, the first engineer, said, well, we're going to build up a nice head of steam, and we're going to race back down. But the second engineer said, maybe that's a little too much. And the first engineer's last words were, I'll risk it. Well, he opened up the throttle, and as he pulled it open, the steamboat's wheels started to turn, and at that moment, all 4 boilers blew to smithereens. And the second engineer watched his boss be cut in half by the steam escaping from the engine. The second engineer himself was thrown from one end of the ship to the other. He managed to survive just about 2 days, long enough to tell his story before he died, because he ended up scalded like a lobster. Very sad story, but it has a happy ending. My dear wife, Susan, she decided 9 years later that she was going to move out west to a little town on Iowa on the Mississippi River called Muscatine. She brought all of our kids. Every single kid survived the trip. Susan survived the trip. All of our daughters married fine, upstanding, prosperous men. All of my sons ended up fine, upstanding, prosperous men, married fine girls. And my oldest, George, he ended up a banker in Minnesota. One day, a fellow walks into his office and holds up a red rock, and he says, "You know what this is? This is the highest grade iron ore in the world, and it's right over there." And so, George is no fool. I mean, he's a descendant of me, he couldn't be a fool. So, he arranges with the money men of Philadelphia to develop the world's biggest iron deposit. It's called the Mesabi Range, and the two of them got very rich. So, even though I didn't achieve success out west, my son did, my family all did very well, and I thank you very much for your patience and for putting up with so many mosquitoes. Thank you much. You're welcome.
Well, good evening, folks. My name is Maurice E. Cook, and I was born in Marlborough on June 30th, 1876. My mother's name was Eunice. My father's name was Herbert. When I was 2 years old in October of 1878, my father bought the Sargent place. You all know it. It's a 65-acre farm on the corner of South Street and Floral Street. We directly moved out here, and in the spring of 1879, my father started farming the property. Our property stretched down Floral Street on the north side. There are many residences there today. There's also the Floral Street School where our farm was today. It was a beautiful flat piece of land that was known to everyone in Shrewsbury for many, many, many years as Cook's Plain. It was a traditional New England farm, growing all the vegetables that you associate with a New England farm. We also had very abundant orchards, apple orchards. We grew peaches, we grew pears, we grew all the berry crops, blueberries, raspberries, strawberries, etc. Anything you could grow on a farm in Massachusetts to bring to market. We didn't do livestock or poultry other than that for our own personal family use. My father was a very progressive, modern thinking farmer. He wasn't educated, but he was able to read, so he was able to subscribe to many agricultural journals. He kept correspondence with farmers throughout the country and the world, actually, about farming techniques. With that attitude, I decided I also wanted to go into farming. With my father's support, financially and in every way, the family sent me to Mass Agricultural College out in Amherst to study agriculture. Mass Agricultural College eventually became what is known today as the University of Massachusetts, but it was originally founded and established as an agricultural school. I did attend the Center High School, located where the library parking lot is, then went on to Mass Aggie, and then came back to Shrewsbury to join my father on the farm, to try to join what I had learned at college with what he had been doing. Now, we had a few small greenhouses on the farm when I came back from school. That isn't very unusual. Greenhouses were used to get seedlings going in the late winter and the early spring, so you'd have more mature plants to plant at the proper time in the growing season in the spring. But what my father did, what was quite innovative at the time, was he experimented with growing plants right in the greenhouse, starting them in the late summer and the early fall, and his plan was he would have vegetables to pick and to market after the killing frosts had taken place in October, late October, November, and into December, because first of all, there'd be little to no competition, the demand would be much higher, we could charge more money for our produce. We never stopped growing in the ground in the summertime traditionally, but we also got very aggressive and invested in building greenhouses. We constructed over 30,000 square feet of greenhouses on what today is known as Ryan Road off of Floral Street to do this winter growing of vegetables operation. And there's quite a skill involved. It's not simply planting plants in a greenhouse, making sure they're kept warm and watering them. Inside, you don't have in the wintertime the birds and the bees. You don't have wind, all things that are necessary for pollination. So we had to come up with ways to do it. The oldest and youngest members of our family had the tasks. We would get brushes like artists would use, very small tipped brushes, and the oldest and the youngest members of our family would have to go to the flowers of things like cucumbers and squashes that the bees normally pollinate, touch the flower with the brush, go to the next flower, go to the next flower, go to the next flower. And that way the fruit could be set and they would grow. For plants that normally had the wind to pollinate, like tomatoes, we would connect tomatoes by strings or various devices so we could shake something and 50 plants would shake and we could get a cloud of pollen in an area and those plants would pollinate and fruit would set and we'd have fruit to pick. We'd also obviously need to keep these greenhouses heated. We did that with giant coal, we had coal-fired boilers. Coal would be delivered to us almost on a daily basis, first by horse-drawn coal wagon from Worcester. Coal cars would come to Worcester by the thousands. We would get our shipments originally, as I said, by 2 horse-drawn wagons, later on by truck. But then once we got the coal, we had to move the coal throughout the farm from to all the different boiler locations. We needed a great deal of labor. Fortunately, Shrewsbury was very much an agricultural community. There were many farmers in town, most of whom didn't have a whole lot to do in the wintertime. So we were able to employ local farmers who obviously knew about growing in our greenhouses in the wintertime. Some we would pay, some we would actually do a barter operation. We would give them so much bench space in the greenhouse for them to grow the seedlings that they would plant out at their own farms the following spring. One of the farms closest to us, if you went up Floral Street and took a right onto Fruit Street heading towards the Turnpike, was the Buttonwood Farm. The Buttonwood Farm was operated by the LeBeau family. Leander LeBeau used to come out and work for me for many, many years in the wintertime. He brought his youngest boy, Reuben, with him many times. I can remember Reuben dashing about from greenhouse to greenhouse. We had constructed tunnels to get from greenhouse to greenhouse. One, so we wouldn't have to open the doors as much in the wintertime and let the cold air in so we could conserve heat. We had these very, very tight tunnels that you could just fit a person through. And the boy would dash from one to another. He was a nice little boy. They were a nice family. Though over time, and then I must tell you that we had to get the product to market. We were in just the perfect situation because just on the other side of Floral Street was the South Street station of the Boston and Worcester Street Railway, the trolley cars. And though we associate, or you associate trolley cars in these days with people moving, they also delivered freight. And actually there was a freight station where the Shrewsbury Sewer and Water Department is today. So we could load vegetables in a wagon and in 5 minutes deliver them to a freight station. We had contracts with purveyors in Boston. Our produce would go to Boston. The purveyors bought our product and then would sell them on to grocers and to restaurants and to hotels. We would also ship west to Worcester. Some of our product would go to the Worcester market, but some would be transferred to refrigerated cars, refrigerated by ice, Railway Express cars, and our produce, winter produce from Floral Street, Shrewsbury, would go to New York City and as far west as Chicago. Over time, as agricultural markets change, it no longer became profitable to do that, the winter vegetables. We never stopped growing in the ground in the summertime, but now what were we to do with our greenhouses? We transformed what we grew in the greenhouses from vegetables to carnations. We became one of the largest growers of carnations in the Northeast. Carnations are a staple of the floral industry. Your florists had to get their flowers from a fairly close marketplace because of spoilage. They had to have fresh product constantly. You can't grow a carnation in New England outside in a growing season. They had to be in a greenhouse. So we would start them outside often, bring them in the greenhouse, grow them in the greenhouse. We'd have wire grids to make the carnations grow with perfectly straight stalks. But then when there would come time to harvest, we would use similar means. We'd take them over to the trolleys, ship them east, ship them west. When the trolley line closed in the 30s, we would then truck our product into Worcester, either sell in the Worcester market or again, go to Union Station, go to the train station at Lincoln Square, and move them out by freight throughout the Northeast. Our family continued to grow carnations at the Floral Street location right up into the 1960s. In the 1960s, there was a tremendous worldwide change in the florist industry, jet planes. You could then grow flowers in other countries of the world where you might not need a greenhouse because it was always warm, where you wouldn't have to pay people a lot of money, and you could air freight them into the US. So almost overnight, our market, our ability to grow and produce and sell carnations went away because we just couldn't compete with that market of the air freighted flowers. So in the 60s, the family decided, with no younger people interested in coming on, the family decided it was time to sell the property. We sold the property, except for some of the residences that family members lived in, to the McGoldrick family of Westboro, the operators of the Green Thumb on the Turnpike Road. They grew there for many years. They grew poinsettias, Easter lilies, geraniums. Then they brokered through potted foliage plants. In the 80s, markets change again. The Canadian government decided it was a great idea to heavily subsidize greenhouse operations in Canada. Those Canadian growers flooded the American market at prices that the American growers couldn't compete with. The McGoldrick family decided it was time to consolidate their operation back to Westboro. They sold the Cook's Plain property. They had already sold the house lots in the front. They sold the Cook's Plain property to the town for the construction of the Floral Street School, and they sold the greenhouse location to a residential developer who developed Ryan Road. Unfortunately, I didn't make it to the 1960s. I died at the age of 55 on July 23rd, 1931. I'm buried here next to my wife Carrie, who actually died just 2 months before I did. I had pretty much what was a traditional funeral for the time in the 30s at the height of the Depression. I was waked and my funeral was held at our family home at 19 Floral Street. The house is still standing. Reverend Thayer from the church came out and conducted the service. It was an average costing funeral for the time. My entire funeral cost $307. The major cost being the casket for $165. It was $15 for the grave diggers to dig the grave. The family needed chairs to accommodate the guests. They were able to rent 6.5 dozen chairs for the whopping sum of $6. That's pretty much the story of the Cook family in Shrewsbury. Members of my family lived on the property until really just a couple years ago. There's houses being constructed kind of up on a hill on South Street, and there was one old house that still remains. Members of the family lived there until recent years. But now families moved to their separate ways. So I'd be happy to try to answer any questions you might have. I thank you very much for coming out tonight to hear what we all have to say. And I just hope that as you drive up and down Floral Street, you might try to imagine on that north side, no houses, no school, just as far as the eye can see, another working farm in the town of Shrewsbury, producing as much as they could out of every square inch of that property, like the dozens and dozens of other farms that were scattered around this town right up into the 1960s. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Elizabeth Curtis. I was Elizabeth Haywood before I got married. Behind us is the Haywood block. So my mother and father. My father was more fortunate than I was. I died at the age of 45 years old in 1777 of the smallpox, one of the epidemics that came through the new colonies that spread this far. My father was lucky, he died in his sleep. My mother lived until she was 86. Just so you know that people did live beyond 40 years old in those days. I married John Curtis. He died a few years before me. We had 6 children. 4 lived to adulthood. I lost 1 at childbirth, and I lost 1 only a few months later. After my husband died, I chose to come back to Shrewsbury, where my mother and father were living at this time. My husband, John, was actually from a very famous family, so to speak, of this area. It was the Curtis family. His great-great-grandfather actually was an Indian fighter, a scout, a trader. His grandfather was actually one of the first tavern owners in what they call Quinsigamon Plantation, which you people know as Worcester. His tavern was located in the area that is now Lincoln Street, and the Curtis grant was inherited through the family. It consisted of around 250 to 300 acres, and you may wonder how I met John. Well, the Haywood grant bounded up against the Curtis grant. My great-great-grandfather was also an Indian fighter. My grandfather also owned a tavern in Worcester, but my grandfather's tavern was more respectful than the Curtis one. In the early 1600s, the Pilgrims brought smallpox with them. It was a European disease, unknown into the New World. When they came through and started settling, it nearly decimated the native population. There are stories of sailors who have traveled up the New England coast to find thousands of Indian villages completely empty. So we brought the disease over, but we all did suffer from it eventually. In our media, which is not like what the media is you have nowadays, our media was a newspaper, printed. The only epidemics that were actually noted in the newspapers were the big ones. There was a big one in 1684, a very massive smallpox outbreak in 1726, and another huge outbreak just before the War of Revolution. The British soldiers, it is thought that the British soldiers brought it with them once again from Europe. And once they were allowed off the boats into a big port like Boston, they freely mingled with the population and the disease was spread. Nowadays, like you people have planes they put people on and they drag diseases all around the world. Well, in those days we had stagecoaches, we had horses, and the disease spread. It spread out this way, and I was one of the victims. I was not fortunate enough to be inoculated. In the 1700s, they found that by inoculating people, it would give the people the same type of conditions and situations, only milder, as what I would have had. This was done by removing the pus from the lesions, the pussy lesions that grew on the body, or if you lived long enough to survive the scabs, they would take the scab off, they would grind it up, and they would literally open your arm, and they would literally put the disease into a healthy person. Like I say, you would get the mild symptoms. Most cases, the fatality rate was very low. John Adams was inoculated when he was only like 14 or 15. In his transits going back and forth to Philadelphia and coming back to Boston, Abigail made the choice herself to inoculate herself and her children. They almost lost one son, but he survived. The inoculation, which was good at that point, and if you survived the disease, you would never get it again. I unfortunately did not survive. And when smallpox comes through, you really don't know at first, do you even have smallpox? There's sometimes a 10 or 12-day incubation period before the actual lesions start breaking out on your body. It's kind of like what you people have the flu now. You get nauseous, you get high fevers, you get headaches. And sometimes, you know, you feel a little better, so you think that it's waning. But that usually is when the next outbreak comes on you. Usually within 10 to 12 days of the incubation period, you start breaking out in a red rash. It usually starts in your throat, in your mouth, on your face, and at that time, it will start affecting your respiratory system. A lot of people died literally of dehydration because they could not drink. After the rash came out, then you would start developing the huge lesions. Now, I don't know if you guys have enough flashlights. This here will show you that smallpox, even though they say it's dead, isn't necessarily dead because these are fairly recent pictures. It would start as a hard bump It would grow bigger and bigger. It would eventually get dark in the middle. And if you got that far, you usually developed the scab. If you developed the scab, you sometimes made it through. I didn't, so. And you know, the mortality rate was really high. They said that in this epidemic, when it came through, not only did it kill a lot of our own militia, but for our own benefit, it killed a lot of British soldiers as well. Once it spread, it started spreading everywhere. A vaccination was not discovered or actually found to work until around the early 1800s. There was 2 physicians that lived down on the Cape, and they were very interested in trying to stop this because, once again, the Cape was a port area where a lot of people were coming in and out and spreading the disease. The disease still was going pretty strong in the early 1800s, and then it started phasing out. But the vaccinations, I'm sure, was part of the help. I have to say, though, that I died of the same disease as Ramses V. It shows that the disease of smallpox was starting back in humanity almost 10 to 15,000 years ago. That the great Egyptian pharaoh Ramses V, after he died, and after studying was done, he actually died of smallpox. So it's been around a long time, and it's been infecting people for a long time. And I guess right now it's considered dead, just like me. Yeah, actually, I think that some of the disease probably is still being found in third world countries, places where, you know, vaccinations are not as readily available. They do call it a dead disease, but who knows?
They haven't given vaccines since 1972, I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So does anyone have any questions, or do you want smallpox?
Now, did they immunize children like that?
The inoculation was done to children as well as adults. Like John Adams, they had their whole family done. And the son that was sickest was his 4-year-old. And they almost did lose that child from inoculating. In fact, John Adams, when he was inoculated, he was in his early teens, and I think it was just before he either went to Harvard or right after he started Harvard University. And he was so sick from it that they thought that he would die. And he didn't, obviously. And but like I say, once the inoculation and eventually the vaccinations were done, it did stop the disease. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much.
Let me take attendance. Since Nathan was a master teacher, there isn't a lot known about him, actually. We know that he was born November 11th, 1759, and he married Dolly Parker on February 10th, 1786. And I celebrate with them on that day, since that's my birthday also. She died November 16th, 1834 at age 72 and is buried here. And he died May 11th, 1847, age 87 and a half. And he's buried right next to her. The amazing thing about them is they had 10 children between 1780 and 1806. And if you look at the dates of the birth dates of their children, it seems like they had one about every 3 years. So they kind of said, oh, time to have another and another, and it just worked out that way for them. One of their sons went to Mexico and lived to middle age and passed away. But their first son, Caleb, born in 1786, went to sea. Now some people might say, gee, that's kind of a strange occupation for people coming from Central Mass, going to sea. But I found in lots of readings and old documents that many men went to sea from this area. I guess it was a place where excitement, and you could make a lot of money probably quickly, and then come back and maybe have enough money to buy yourself a farm or part of a farm. Well, the son Caleb went to sea in 1809 on a very large cargo ship, and it was taken over by the Spanish. And he was sent to Santo Domingo, where he died of yellow fever in 1809. So going to sea wasn't such a good idea for him. Now the Pratts in 1803 built part of Stone Meadow Farm, which is right down at number 35 Boylston Circle. I would suggest you take a ride by that tomorrow and see the original part of the house is 1803. They sold it in 1817. Now, he was a farmer and a town assessor and a moderator for 1 year, and he was a master teacher. We'll talk about that in a little while. He also had one of the most dangerous jobs during the Revolutionary War in 1778 to 1780. Most people would think, what was he in? The infantry, the artillery, or something like that? He was a drummer. And where were the drummers and the fife players when they're going out to battle? They're right out there in front. Now, I don't know how much you know about the history of Shrewsbury, so I'm going to give you some information. There's going to be a quiz on it, since he was a school teacher. Now, I found a map at the Supreme Court in Boston that was made in 1702, and it was a map that showed a piece of land which lieth between Quinsigamog Plantation and Marlborough Plantation, and that is, of course, where we're standing now, Shrewsbury. So, when does Shrewsbury come to be? Well, in 1718, proprietors got together. They're having meetings, and they start planning for the future of Shrewsbury. In 1727, it becomes Shrewsbury. But where is the southern border? We know now it's Grafton. But what was it in 1718? We know Sutton is 1704, and within Sutton there was a piece of native people's land, 7,500 acres, called Hassanamisco, and above that was a strip of land that was still Sutton. In 1728, 40 proprietors were allowed to purchase that land from the native people. And the native people, of course, as happened with a lot of native people, didn't get their 2,500 pounds out of it, as they should have. But in 1735, that piece of land becomes the town of Grafton. And that stretch of land on the north of Grafton becomes Grafton also. So now we have the southern border of Shrewsbury. But what about the northern border of Shrewsbury? Where was that? I didn't give that to you as homework last night, evidently. Well, Lancaster. The southern border of Lancaster was the northern border of Shrewsbury. And over the years, pieces were taken off to form other towns. In 1786, the northern precinct of Shrewsbury becomes Boylston, and in 1813, the western part of Boylston becomes West Boylston, and so on, so forth with all those towns. The southeast corner of Shrewsbury part of it goes to Westboro, some to Grafton, and other areas leave. So we end up with Shrewsbury in the confines of what it is today. Now, when they gave the proprietors the land, they had to give a school lot number 20 out to the town, and they had to have a minister's lot also. So what we have here is school lot number 20 that is at Rocky Pond. Now, Rocky Pond, that we know, is over in Northborough right now, isn't it? On the western side of Northborough, it's almost in Boylston. So that was that part of Shrewsbury that was on that area. Now, what do we do for teachers here? In the summertime, we had the young children who went to school for 6, 8, 10 weeks, and they were taught by a female. And in the wintertime, we had the older kids. And I mean older, they're 14, 15, 16. I have some letters that say that some students were still in school at age 18, 19, and 20. They opted to go to school. So why was it like that? And this school in the wintertime was taught by a male, a master teacher such as Nathan Pratt. Why would they break it up like that? Well, the older students were more valuable on the farm in the summertime. And back then, since we weren't in the Industrial Revolution yet, really, what were these older ones going to do around the farm? I mean, you could only repair so much, and everything wasn't mechanized, so you weren't repairing your tractors or manure spreaders or that type of thing. So they would go to school in the wintertime, when they could also go through some bad weather and get there. The younger kids went in the summertime because it was easy for them to get to school, and the men around the farms were working out in the fields, and the women were working very hard basically in the kitchens, keeping everything going in the household. Now these female teachers were sometimes 15, 16, 17 years old, and they didn't go to school to become a teacher. They went to school, and somebody saw that they were wonderful at elocution, they were wonderful at the English language, they could do ciphering really well, and they had a nice way about them, so that they would get a letter from a teacher saying that this person, their name, would be a wonderful teacher, and I stand behind her 100%. And that person would go out and try to get a job teaching. Now, back then you got a job teaching only for a certain amount of time. It wasn't one of these things where you got a job and thought maybe you're going to stay there for 30 or 40 years. If you got hired for 6 weeks at $7 a week, and you had to take your room and board out of that $7, at the end of the 6 weeks you were out of a job. You had to go somewhere else, usually home, until you heard that there was another job opening like that. And the same thing happened with the males in the winter. That's why Nathan Pratt, who we don't have a lot of information on about when he taught, but we know he was teaching in the wintertime. He did well because he lived in town and he kept doing that over and over again, and the townspeople knew him quite well. Now, I have here some items that, of course, these are books that we use. These are the late 1700s, early 1800s. We have English books, math books, a lot of geography and history, and Greek and Latin books, for the older kids. And here I have, so you can see, these are the slates. And not every kid had a slate back then. Oftentimes the teacher would put something on here like this. Okay, what am I holding up, class? Can you see? Nobody knows? What am I holding up, class?
A and B.
A, okay, we have one person, the rest of you didn't do your homework. The kids made their own books. Here we have a math book, and they would be graded not only on the math, but on neatness, on their English, how they wrote. Look at this. Look how wonderful this is for a math book. That is fantastic.
Did somebody write that?
Oh yes, this is beautiful writing, because that's what they had to do. Look at this.
That's beautiful writing.
Reduction of decimal cases, and then they did the math and explained everything. Wow. This is before they had those things that you plug into the wall and go like this on, right? And here's another one that I really like. This one was a 16-year-old girl, and look at this wonderful drawing she did, just to put her name in it, and her age, 16 in 1830. Nice. She did this wonderful drawing, and then, not to be outdone, look at the work she did.
No, look, somebody actually wrote that.
She wrote that with a. We're not talking here ballpoint pens either.
No.
Wonderful, wonderful work.
Beautiful work.
So she did a great job.
She didn't even have a computer.
No. Well, she did, and it was between her ears.
Yeah, right.
So, you're welcome to look at the books or anything else. Any questions? I hope you had a good time this evening.